My motivation to do this research comes from a place of both curiosity, concern, and again, a sense of urgency. I understand from decades of experience in the corporate world, business leaders really privilege numeracy more than stories. And this understanding informs my research detailed in my subsequent podcasts. I have been enculturated in my years of working with business leaders to speak the language of money, of marketing, of neoliberal tactics to extract revenue from customer bases to create value for shareholders. In this endeavor, I'm attempting, at least partially, to speak to the money behind board games. This research is designed to inform large publishers and their financial backers about how representation, diversity, and inclusion is a serious risk management challenge for their future growth. As a former tech reporter, I see parallels between board gaming and the early days of the personal computing industry. In the early 90s, I worked as a tech reporter and later communications advisor to communications and tech companies in Canada and the US. One very well-known company, today part of the so-called Frightful Five, Facebook, Amazon, Google, and Microsoft, and of course Apple, they had a corporate performance model that was focused almost entirely on market expansion. When I did work for this company, I experienced firsthand how doggedly focused this giant, already at that stage, was on expanding out from its beachhead market of white, male, middle-class, quote-unquote early adopters. This company's entire goal was to create interest in personal computing to different demographies and walks of life, from kids to moms to grandparents to specific industry sectors who could benefit from automation. This tech giant worked to create computing literacies and expand the addressable market for computing, software and hardware, dividing up and driving broad-based interest in personal computing. This company spent the lion's share of its marketing budget relentlessly, driving at expansion initiatives and wooing new users. This tech leader gave stuff away, held computing literacy workshops, and hired personal computing evangelists to roam Canada and the US, winning friends and influencing people in untapped, underrepresented communities and market segments. This company now runs workshops on cruise ships, retirement communities, to provide computing literacy to aging users. Their strategy works. This client thrived and grew into a titan of the global marketplace. However, this was not the fate of another technology client of mine. This ill-fated hardware and software company no longer exists. Its technologies were subsumed by acquisition by another hardware company, which in turn also no longer exists. The client that failed to understand market expansion was somewhat infamous in the tech community for its technical elitism, focusing on a small pool of scientific and technical users to the exclusion of any other markets. This client even had a president who famously said, "There is no reason for any individual to have a computer in his home." There was an elitism that pervaded the ranks of this organization, one arguably rooted in gendered and racialized understandings of their marketplace. These folks thought that spending any time on expanding their base was a waste of time and resources. I both see and hear a similar kind of blinkered, elitist view in board gaming, grounded in myths about gender and race. There's a focus on an imagined audience of real, quote-unquote gamers, and the real addressable market that seems rooted in a familiar-sounding elitism, the same lack of imagination about addressable markets. It was these same discourses and debates that pervaded the early days of personal computing within some companies that didn't survive. And while companies looked out beyond their comfortable and familiar base of users and cultivated broader audiences, they did not only survive, but these companies that embraced expansion thrived. Lastly, on the subject of self-disclosure and motivation to do this research, I love games. I need games. As my friends and family have often noted, I'm a fervent board game evangelist. I hand out board games to those I care about like a kind of medicine. Indeed, I do believe games are medicine. I believe that we all need games for a variety of reasons, from education to enhancing an understanding of how to look at and solve complex problems, to offering a way to engage with others, providing a means to communicate complex ideas, and tell human narratives in a way that helps people live through and truly feel through these stories. I'm an obsessive board game collector and longtime gamer, and prior to the pandemic, you could find me at any number of friendly local game stores in Toronto several times a week. I'm a member of online board game forums. In game stores, in game meetups, and online, I've experienced some of the problematic behaviors detailed by women, non-binary, LGBTQ+, and BIPOC people who have come forward and shared their stories with me in this research. On my weekly trek to buy Magic the Gathering cards at a store with a, shall we say, difficult reputation, I was regularly corrected, dismissed, or ignored outright as I attempted to make purchases. At board game meetups, it is my partner, who identifies as a man who is addressed and spoken to when I make a comment or ask a question. I've been ignored, talked over, and insulted. I'm frequently interrogated by members of the board gaming community in an effort to have me prove my knowledge, or nerd cred, when it comes to games. Once, when describing a board game design project I was working on, a close acquaintance in the board gaming community blurted out, "You've designed a game? What is it, a roll and move?" This remark was meant as an insult, as roll and move games are considered childish and unserious within the hobby community. And that's a notion that is another form of gatekeeping in and of itself. I've had academic colleagues tell me that this specific research exercise is quote-unquote meaningless, adding, and this is a true story from a professor, quote, "They are just games. Of course they have pictures of women with their boobs out," unquote. As noted earlier, I've received online hate and threats for the work I am doing. I've seen longtime members of board game groups online leave those communities simply because someone shared one of my earlier studies. I've heard the line, quote, "Keep your politics out of my games," unquote, more times than I can count. To this I say I can't and I won't, because to do so is an impossibility. Games are political, and the labor of game design is political. I'm going to discuss this in greater depth a bit later in this podcast series. I know that this work, along with other quantitative and qualitative feminist media analysis, are critically important endeavors as we as a culture seek to create a more perfect, just, and cohesive society, and that the arc and the course of the moral universe moves toward justice. I believe a systemic lack of equity and inclusion in society, business spaces, and cultural practices limits human progress, blocks innovation, stunts growth, and subjects people to a variety of indignities, and ultimately harms and kills people. I believe with everything that I am that a culture that blocks or denies the full inclusion of all people is a culture that prevents human flourishing. It is a culture that is corrupt at its core. All of this has spurred me to ask the questions posed by this research. So why is board gaming so white and so male? The board game community and the wider hobby community are grappling with systemic problems caused by the lack of equity, diversity, and inclusion, driving an ever louder chorus of voices in the board game enthusiast community to call for change. A lack of representation in board game production, inclusion in gaming spaces, and an absent diversity of themes, characters, and stories told by board games has stunted the potential growth of the hobby. Vocal participants in board gaming have called for board games to be made for a wider demographic of players, and for the industry to be more open to opportunities for women, BIPOC, LGBTQ+ creators. Despite the growing popularity of analog games, there exists a significant gender and racial imbalance in the labor of board game creation and a gender and racial imbalance in the hobbyist community. This research effort seeks to fill the gap in both academic scholarship on the representation of women, BIPOC inclusion and diversity in the gaming industry and in the spaces where gaming is practiced, the gendered labor of board game production, the gender and racial gap in the board gaming design and artwork, I will argue creates a vicious circle of exclusion and delimits the wider adoption of this cultural practice. Some commentators have argued that a renewed mainstream interest in board games is due to an intergenerational cultural yearning for face-to-face interaction in a play activity that recalls a time before smartphones. Board gaming has become a pastime that is enjoying increased attention and active cultural practice. However, the nostalgia associated with board games, tied as it is with idealized ideas of that simpler time, and that means maybe less complicated, more homogeneous, less diverse time, it all comes with socio-cultural baggage. Mass market and hobby board games have often relied on a narrow spectrum of themes, game mechanics, and imagery. Agricultural vistas inhabited by blonde-haired, blue-eyed farmers, the Eurocentric lore of knights fighting orcish hordes, Vikings pillaging coastal villages, or sprawling mercantile or imperial empires. Over the last 40 years, popular board games have been often very reliant on literary properties such as Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, and at least 229, there's probably more now, of unique board game titles with that theme alone in the Tolkien universe. As with these literary, cinema, and television properties, games are dominated by mainly white male protagonists, styled in the same fashion as literary and filmic variants of Campbell's monomyth. These overwhelmingly white male heroes have heroic traits and agency to conquer any obstacle, slay the monsters, claim the treasure, and of course, rescue the damsel in distress. Like traditional tropes and themes in these intellectual properties, the board gaming publishing community, some have argued, is mired in a recursive, regressive, and white male-dominated past. There is a demographic shift happening in gaming, however, with some observers noting that in digital gaming at least, it has now achieved parity between those who identify as women and those who identify as men. An increasing number of studies demonstrate that women are fast becoming a dominant demographic segment in digital gaming. Women currently represent 46% of gamers in the US, a number that continues to rise. Recent digital gamer studies tell us that video gaming is increasingly pervasive and mainstream in the US, with 64% of US households containing a device to play video games. Adult women represent at least 33% of all US gamers, and in fact, in some categories outnumber males under 18 years of age, which represent 17% of all gamers. So there's more women than 18-year-old men. Another study found that women made up 46% of the digital and video gaming community in the US in 2019. That's an increase of 4% over 2017. And Pew Research found that 24% of Black respondents reported playing video games often, and 21% playing them sometimes. 18% of Hispanics reported playing often, and 29% reported playing sometimes. In Canada, the average age of self-reported gamers is 39 years old, with a demographic split evenly between those who identify as male and female. So the average gamer is actually a middle-aged woman. And behind these numbers is a more expansive definition of what is now considered a digital game, with the rise of the so-called casual revolution, as articulated by Jesper Juhl in 2010. This recognizes the inclusion of quick-play mobile games that integrate into daily living more seamlessly than more traditionally recognized games, such as first-person shooters and open-world sandbox role-playing games, geared toward a so-called hardcore category of gamers. Jewel plotted the trajectory of video games from arcade beginnings to where we are all welcome to enjoy these early games casual welcome, to a time when the video game industry became increasingly commercialized and the imagined audience of mostly white male hardcore gamers hardened and calcified. That myth in our minds limits us. But Jewel notes that gaming could not stay stuck in that so-called hardcore valley for long. And the shift to a new casual revolution opened up video gaming to an increasingly wider and wider audience. To video games' benefit. Now, while academic peer-reviewed demographic studies for digital game players abound, recent surveys of analog gamers are often informal, conducted by games publishers or enthusiasts outside of the peer-reviewed scholarly process. As a researcher in the field of digital and board games, I've often heard the argument that women specifically simply do not play board games, and certainly do not play them with any regularity. This is a talking point I've encountered while browsing through posts on our board games on Reddit, or when I used to be on X or Twitter, I have since left. It was a constant refrain. If one were to look at available demographic studies conducted by these hobbyist sites and enthusiasts, the argument that women don't board game with any regularity might be lent some specific, significant credence. The number of self-reported board game fans among women, BIPOC, and other marginalized groups remains quite low in these hobbyist studies. A 2019 board gaming study conducted by Meeple Mountain, a board game enthusiast site, found that 69% of those who filled out the online survey identified as men, 27% identified as women, and 0.02% identified as non-binary. Publisher Stonemaier Games in 2017 conducted a demographic survey that elicited more than 3,000 responses among the publisher's subscribers, reported to be 30,000 in total, and found that 91.7% of those respondents were men, and 8.1% were women. In 2019, the number of women subscribers to the Stonemaier survey response rose to little under 20%, 17.9%, with 81.1% identifying as men. The website The Daily Worker Placement in 2016 published the results of a demographic survey of more than 2,000 respondents and found that 24% of board gamers were women, 1.1% non-binary, and 0.6% were trans, leaving the remainder, the majority, at 74.3%, identifying as male. The overwhelming majority of survey respondents were also white, with the Daily Worker Placement survey reporting only 2.1% respondents were Chinese, 2.7% were Latin American, 0.6% were Indigenous, and 0.7% were Filipino. Booth noted that only 89 respondents to a survey of 837 participants for his book, Board Games as Media, were BIPOC, so that's a little under 11%. Another survey conducted by Booth garnered respondents who identified as women at 27%. Some of these surveys might be challenged by issues involving limited promotions, a fear of a lack of anonymity for the respondents, or a feeling that the information might be used to try and sell them something. These surveys might also attract a small pool of participants who have already got an existing relationship with a publisher or publication. As such, these surveys only give us a limited, imperfect glimpse into that true picture of how many women, BIPOC, and LGBTQ+ people participate in gaming. Tune in next episode, where I share with you some of the context of representation in gaming and why it matters.